So I think a majority of the things we've been shown for Borderlands 4 so far has been on the right track, and I think it's won over quite a lot of people. But I also think that the longevity and end game that we get on the launch of Borderlands 4 is also going to be very important for how the game is received, more specifically for the more hardcore player base. So I want to talk about pretty much all the information we've gotten so far on the end game, and also go over some things that seem like they're also going to tie into that end game. But also keep in mind the developers have been trying not to tell us a bunch about the end game. It seems that some of the future reveals will specifically be based around the end game, so we'll get a lot more information there, but we still have a handful of things to go over. Now, because Borderlands games are looter shooters, they're RPGs, and they're loot driven games, a lot of these systems and elements that you'll be using from right when you start the game will also be very important into the end game. And that brings me to probably one of the biggest changes going into Borderlands 4, and it's also going to be one of the most important systems in the game, especially in the end game, is the weapons and weapons parts system. Now, I've gone over this in multiple videos. I have videos detailing the entirety of the system, but in Borderlands 4, you'll have your handful of weapon manufacturers. There are going to be 8 of them. So let's say any weapon you get as a drop will be one of those 8 manufacturers, but then all of the other parts on that weapon, so like the magazine, the barrel, other attachments that can be on it, can all be randomly rolled between any of the other 7 main manufacturers and 3 other weapon manufacturers that are parts only. So essentially you have this massive amount of RNG for any weapon you get, and as you go higher and higher rarities of weapons or gear, those items can just have more different parts on them. And this also includes legendary items, so you could be using 4 of the same legendary item, and all 4 of those would have completely different functions and completely different behaviors outside of the legendary effect that would be on that legendary item. So there's just a ridiculous amount of RNG and a ridiculous amount of possibilities that'll tie back into a lot of other elements. Whatever build you're trying to use, whatever synergies you have with your gear, whatever synergies you're having with your skill tree. And then when you take all of that, you take all these randomly rolled weapons, you take all their weapon parts, you tie that all back in with your gear, and then you consider that with Borderlands 4, they're making items much more rare. They're making legendaries a lot more rare than they were in Borderlands 3. You tie that all together and items are just going to be much more rare. You have a lot more RNG with these items to get all these crazy possibilities. So just going through the game, especially in the early and mid game, you're probably not going to be finding just crazy amounts of legendaries like we did in Borderlands 3. So once you get into the end game, you'll probably have tons of legendaries that you still haven't gotten, even if they're a dedicated drop from bosses you've already killed. And that just pushes back the gearing process more and more towards the end game, which, while this isn't an end game specific feature, this is going to be a very big part of your end game. Not even just trying to get more gear to do difficult content, just even trying to find all of the different legendaries throughout the game is going to be something that takes a lot longer into the end game than previous entries. But we do actually have a few pieces of information on actual features that are more endgame specific, some of which are only endgame specific. And one of them being the replacement for badass ranks. So in previous Borderlands games, let's say Borderlands 3, you had badass ranks where once you would get to max level, you would then essentially just keep leveling up and you would get points to put into these badass ranks. And those were essentially just stat increases, and you would just keep getting more and more of them. And that would just keep making you stronger and stronger. Essentially, the longer you played, it was very small stat increases, but you just keep getting more badass ranks. And they're going to have a system like this, so an end game specific progression system, but it seems they're going away with all the flat bonuses. I think they specifically said these aren't going to be flat bonuses. These are going to be much more meaty and meaningful choices that you get as you get into this end game system. So presumably, instead of just getting like a small stat increase, you're probably going to be choosing between actual meaningful effects that you'll actually be able to feel in combat, and this will just give you more choices and things to focus around the build you're trying to create. And I do hope the version of this system we're getting in Borderlands 4 is not infinite. I hope it takes quite a lot of time to actually progress completely through it, but I hope it's not infinite. I really don't like end game systems in RPGs that are completely infinite and infinitely grindable. You had things like that in Diablo 3, where you had the infinitely grindable Paragon system. You essentially had a similar system to that in Borderlands 3 as well. So I hope it's a long-term progression system, but not infinite, and these more meaningful choices are going to be a lot more interesting than just small stat increases. And the other endgame specific system we've gotten information on is the firmware system, and they specifically talked about this being an endgame gearing system. And I went over this in a previous video because these are essentially the gear sets of Borderlands 3. So on your enhancement mod, your shield mod, and your class mod, you can get these additional effects on them that have a number out of 3 on them. And as you continue to gear up and get the items you want with these firmware rolls on them, and you get the 3 out of 3, you get an additional effect or additional power, whether it be damage or utility or something else. We still haven't gotten detailed what types of effects these are actually going to be, but this is seeming like another layer of progression that they added to specifically be more in the end game. So you probably won't be getting these 3 out of 3 firmware sets while leveling up or going through the campaigns. But as you get closer to the end game and get into the end game, this is probably going to be another big piece of progression, getting the actual mods you want with the roles you want, but then also getting them with the firmware rolls on them, because there are a bunch of different firmwares. So there are a bunch of different gear sets you can get, and they're obviously all going to have a bunch of different effects. That's going to add a lot to also grinding these specific items. Now, we did also get it teased or just specifically said that invincible or raid bosses will be returning for Borderlands 4, but we don't know if this is actually going to be on launch or if we're going to be getting those in some DLC or update after launch. Now, my theory is that we will actually have these raid bosses or invincible bosses on the launch of the game, but I have no idea how many we would be getting. Me personally, I would want at least a handful of them for the end game, and all of those being incredibly difficult. But we do know of another system that may actually have invincible bosses in them, and that's the vaults of Borderlands 4, which are actually calling vault dungeons, because we've gotten a little bit of information on how the system works. Because essentially, as you go throughout all of the different zones in Borderlands 4 on launch, you'll be able to start to look for and find these vault key fragments. And once you find enough of these vault key fragments, it'll give you the key, and that will unlock a vault for you. We know there are multiple vaults in the game on launch, and the developers specifically talked about these as being difficult dungeons, which vaults have never been described as before. And you usually don't hear developers talking about things in new Borderlands games as specifically being difficult. So it sounds like they are actually trying to turn vaults into these dungeons that have a lot of difficulty in them, that you have a progression system of going through, finding all the vault key fragments to actually unlock them. And because of how Borderlands 4 is set up, in that it will consist of 4 different zones that are all absolutely massive, and once you get into that zone, it's seamless. So it seems like there will only be load screens between those 4 different zones. I would not be surprised at all if each one of those zones has its own vault, and you have to go through and progress through each one of those zones to find all the vault key fragments of that zone to open the vault of that zone. And then we also know that once you unlock the vault, you can just reset it like you can all the other bosses in the game. So you're not going to have to go back and get all the vault key fragments to farm more of the vault, and it's going to be repeatedly farmable like all of the other missions or bosses throughout the entirety of the game. And on top of that, I would not be surprised if there is an end game version of these vault dungeons. Like maybe we have those 4 vault dungeons that we go through as part of like the main story and campaign, and then maybe there's like an end game version that has like an invincible boss at the end and is super difficult. There's a lot of different possibilities with this, but I'm hoping these are actually really difficult into the end game and in some way tie back into maybe end game specific systems. But I think the biggest determining factor of what content we're actually going to be doing for the end game of Borderlands 4 is the difficulty system and how it's implemented. We already know there is a difficulty system in Borderlands 4, at at least for the campaign, we got to see that they were on normal mode for the gameplay showcase. We do also know that if you're playing with other people during the campaign, that each one of the people in your party could have a different difficulty set for their campaign, and that will still work for each one of you. So you'd all be playing on a different difficulty, and presumably this difficulty is either just going to progress into the end game and there will be a bunch of difficulties and you can just keep progressing that into the end game, or after you get through the campaign, there's just going to be a different difficulty specific to the end game. And I would very much not be surprised if that's the case, because a lot of ARPGs do this. Even something specific like Diablo 4, you have essentially 4 difficulties that are kind of pre-end game, and then once you get into the end game, you have 4 more difficulties that you progress through. And I would not be surprised if they're taking more inspiration from ARPGs for difficulty, because they've already done that for the modifiers on a lot of the elites or mini bosses, and it seems like they're just taking a lot more cues from ARPGs for Borderlands 4 than they have with previous Borderlands games. And the reason this is so important is because if they have a really robust and well-made difficulty system, literally every piece of content throughout the game gets turned into a piece of endgame content. Like, let's say there's a really cool, unique item you get from a mission in Borderlands 4, but you want a max level version of this, a max power version of this once you get into the end game. Well, if they have a good difficulty system, it makes all of that content end game content, because then you tie that back into the new system coming with Borderlands 4, where you can replay any boss or any mission with the flip of a switch. That'll just make all of this content very relevant in the end game. It won't be end game specific, but all of this content will just be end game content with the higher difficulties, the more powerful gear, and just everything you would want in an end game. And even with that being said, I don't think any of us really have a clue of how the endgame difficulty system is going to work. Because we have this new system that allows us to replay missions whenever we want, we're almost certainly not getting a new game plus feature or a true Vault Hunter mode, because there's not really a reason to have that when you can replay all of the content of the game at the flip of a switch whenever you want. So almost certainly they're going with a more ARPG inspired difficulty system into the endgame, but we have no idea how difficult this is going to get. We have no idea how any of that is actually going to work. I'm actually really hoping that they have a lot of difficulty increase, so much so that you can get to a point where maybe no builds will really be able to do it. Just allow us to essentially tune the difficulty to pretty much exactly how we want it, no matter how hard that would actually be. So this is one of the things I'm most excited for to learn more about for Borderlands 4, how the endgame is going to be and how much longevity it's going to have on launch. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.